In this episode of Toy Time, Maureen Stover teaches high school students an environmental science lesson about erosion. Have fun in this outdoor lesson that explores the importance of taking care of our environment.
Hi, I'm Maureen Stover, and I'm coming to you today from the banks of the Rockfish Creek, which is located in Cumberland County, North Carolina. Cumberland County is in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is about an hour south of Raleigh and about an hour north of South Carolina, right on I-95. In Cumberland County, I teach biology, earth and environmental science, and Avid 2 at Cumberland International Early College High School. I'm also the 2020 Burroughs Welcome Fund Sandhills Region Teacher of the Year. And today, because we're sitting on the banks of the Rockfish Creek, we are going to be talking about erosion and how erosion is a mechanism that changes the landscape of our planet. Now, as we get started on our lesson today, there are going to be some supplies that you're going to need. First thing you're going to need are 3 2-liter bottles and a couple of 16-ounce water bottles. You can just grab these out of your recycle bin. And if you don't have these exact size water bottles, that's okay. Just grab anything that you have laying around your house. We're also going to need some materials like some dried leaves, and I just grabbed some dry leaves from my backyard, some rocks, some sand, and some potting soil. So you don't have to actually buy any of this. This is all stuff that you can just collect from your backyard. So go out there and dig up some dirt, dig up some sand, find some rocks, and find some dried leaves. We're also going to need some vegetation. So you can either dig up something from your yard, or if you want to stop at a nursery and get something, you could do that too. Some scissors, some string or twine, and then also a hole puncher. So once you have all those supplies gathered, we'll move on to the next step so you can set up your experiment. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to cut our water bottles so that we can use them in our experimental design. Now, this can be very dangerous because it is sometimes difficult to cut through the plastic. So please make sure that you are using proper safety procedures and you're cutting smartly. You may want to ask your mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or an aunt or uncle or someone else to help you while you do this part of the process, just to make sure you don't accidentally cut yourself. So what you're going to do here is you're going to cut about the top third off the 2-liter bottle. And the 2-liter bottle is the one that Cokes and Pepsi and Mountain Dew would come in normally when you buy it at the grocery store. You're going to cut that off. So when you cut it off, you should still have the full spout on the end of the bottle. You're also going to take a 16-ounce water bottle, and this is just the normal size water bottle that you get when you buy a water bottle, and you're going to cut that in half. So you're going to have the bottom part of the container is going to be almost kind of like a dish or a bowl, and then you'll have the top half of the container will be the part that had the place where the lid would screw on. Once you finish that, you are just going to put those off to the side so that you are ready to go as we move on to the next part of our experiment. Now, the first thing we need to do is to make a vessel that's going to capture the water during our experiment. So what you're going to need to do is take the hole puncher and you're going to punch 2 holes in the bottom part of the small water bottle that you cut in half. So you can see here where I'm punching that in the side, you're going to punch 2 holes, 1 on each side. So you'll have a total of 6 holes once you finish this whole process. Then you're going to take the twine and you're going to feed the twine through those holes. Now, it's a little bit hard to see in this picture how I did that, but what you're essentially going to do is lace it through kind of like you would lace your shoes. So you just feed it through so that it's going to have some of the rope going through, and you're going to be able to then tie that into a loop. So now you're going to have like a hanger or a loop that you're going to be able to hang off the end of the 2-liter water bottle. And this is going to be how we're going to catch the water and sediment. This is then going to act as a container to capture that water and sediment as it filters through the 2-liter bottle material, and then it will be collected into this cup. Now that we have our collection vessel finished, we're going to move on to prepping our 2-liter containers that are going to hold our sediment and material that we're going to be testing. So in each one of the 3-liter containers, you are going to put a base of rock and sand. And just make sure you have approximately the same amount of rock and sand in each one of those containers. If it's not exactly the same amount in each one, that's not critical. Just try to get it as close as you can. Then once you have your base layer put down, we're then going to add some soil to each one of the containers. Now, this can either just be soil you dig up from your yard, or if you have a bag of potting soil or some other type of soil in your shed or in your garage, that is fine to use too. So just put the dirt into the container, and here you want to put about even amounts of dirt in each one of the 3 containers, again, to make sure we're keeping things consistent. In the second water bottle, we're going to add a layer of dried leaves on top of the sand, rocks, and topsoil. Now, you do not have to do anything special to get these leaves. These are actually leaves that I just collected from my backyard. So just go out in your yard or look around your neighborhood and just find some old, dry, crunchy leaves and add those to the top of this water bottle. In our third water bottle, we're going to add vegetation. So you can either use some grass or different plants that you might find in your yard. You could also go to a nursery like Walmart or any other place where they sell plants and get a few plants there that you could use to plant inside of your third water bottle. In today's lesson, there's going to be several key terms that we're going to be discussing. So be sure to listen for these key terms as we go through the experiment today. First, we'll have infiltration, deposition, erosion, sediment, wetlands, river basins, and watersheds. In today's lesson, there's also going to be 2 things that you should be able to do once we finish. First, you're going to be able to explain how erosion changes the earth by transporting sediment from one area to another. And you are also going to analyze how the rate of erosion is affected by vegetation. All right, so once you have your experiment all set up and you've cut your water bottles the way that I showed you to cut them, you are going to have 3 separate water bottles, and you're going to hang your smaller water bottles off the end of the neck. In my first water bottle, I just have the rock, the sand, and some topsoil. In my second, I have the rocks, sand, and some dried leaves. And in my third, I have rock, sand, dried leaves, and then also some vegetation. So what we're going to do is we are going to put some water into each one of these containers, and we're going to see what happens. Now, before we actually do this, I want you to take a second to make a prediction of what you think is going to happen. Do you think we're going to end up with the same thing happening in all 3 of our experimental design pieces, or do you think something different will happen as we pour water into each one of these different vessels? Now, I do have some water here in mason jars, and this holds about a half liter or 500 milliliters of water. So just grab any type of container you have. It doesn't matter if you have exactly the right amount of water. We just want to make sure we're putting an equal amount of water into each one of our containers. So just be sure that whatever you're using to fill up your water with, that you're putting the same amount of water into each one of your experiments. I also have some extra water just in case we need it, because you never know if you're going to have enough water or not. So we're going to start here with our very first one, which just has the dirt, the rock, and the sand in it. And I'm going to take my water and I'm going to slowly pour it into the container. Now, you'll probably have a little bit spilling, and that's part of the reason why we're doing this outside. You're going to slowly pour that into the container. And it looks like we are going to need just a little bit more water. So we'll put some more water in there too, and we're going to see what happens. Now, if you're following along with me at home, you probably got a similar result to this, where you have a lot of dirt and a lot of cloudy water, and that cloudy water is because this dirt, which is what we call sediment, or small particles, is going to be suspended in the water. So that's why when you look at a river, you look at a creek sometimes, especially after a rainstorm, a lot of times it looks like it's muddy. And that's because there's actually dirt particles that are suspended in the water. Now in our next experiment, we're going to see what happens when we add this water in with the leaves. And again, because we added a little bit of extra water into the first one, we're going to probably need to add a little bit of extra water into this one too. Okay, so this one also, we're seeing that you do get some sediment that's going to wash out of the container. but it's not nearly as cloudy and there's not nearly as much sediment. So I'd like you to take a second just to think about that. Why did that happen? Why is it that this one is cloudy and has a lot of sediment and this one is not as cloudy and doesn't have as much sediment? What is the difference between these two different setups that we have that would maybe change what our result is coming out of our container? Now in my last container, I have plants. Now I have some plants that I purchased at Walmart, but you can just pull up some grass from your yard. You could get flowers that are growing in nature out in the wild. Whatever you have around your house is perfect. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna pour my water into my sample with my plants. And again, I use the same kind of topsoil for all three of these different experiments to make sure that we were using the same type of materials so that there wouldn't be any difference in how the sand, gravel, and rock would affect our experiment. Okay, so here we don't have as much water coming out, number one, right? So there's hardly any water coming out of this one at all. Why do you think that is? What is it that these plants have that is making it so that that water is not flowing down into out of the container and into our little water bottle at the bottom? So just take a second to think about that. And if you thought, wow, I wonder if it's because the roots are absorbing that water, you're exactly right. So you'll remember that when you learn about the plant systems, that in vascular plants, they have two special types of vascular tissue, which is called the phloem and the xylem. So the xylem zips water up through the roots. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen here, is that xylem is taking that water, the roots are absorbing that water, and it's bringing it up into the plants. So what we see here is that there's not as much erosion. You don't have as much material or sediment that gets moved by the water when you have vegetation in place. In my first example, where we didn't have any vegetation and we didn't have any dry leaves at all, there was quite a bit of erosion. So I had a pretty significant amount of sediment that was moved by the water as it came down and came into my container. In my second example, I have leaves, and those leaves help to filter some of that water, and those leaves also absorb some of that water. So even though those leaves are dead and they're dry leaves, they do still absorb some of the water, and they filter that water as it goes down into the ground. And you'll remember that we learned that that is called infiltration. So infiltration is as it rains and the water goes down into the dirt, it actually gets cleaned out and filtered as it moves through the different layers of the dirt until it gets down into the aquifer layer. And then finally here in my third example, I have these plants, the vegetation, and the vegetation has root systems. So with that vegetation, what we see is that the root systems actually absorb the water as the water is raining down on the planet. So some of the water does actually make it down into the dirt and will actually move some sediment, but most of the water is going to remain in this container because it was absorbed by the root system. So this is something really important to consider when we look at building new roads, building new houses, or removing vegetation. When we remove vegetation from forested areas, or even when we remove grass from yards, we are making it so that there's not as much erosion control. And that can be a real problem, especially when we live in an area like North Carolina where we do get frequent rainstorms. So it is very important to consider how vegetation affects erosion. And it's something that we definitely need to be aware of as a human impact that could have a negative influence on our ecosystems. Okay, so let's do a couple close-up looks here. So this was my first experimental design. And in this experimental design, what I noticed is that I ended up with a significant amount of water that came out of the container. I also still have quite a bit of water that is inside the container though, right? So you can see that my dirt is now really damp. And the water is still really cloudy. So if I put my hand kind of behind here, you cannot see my hand through there. And my container is completely filled up with water, and I even had some overflow. In my second experiment, I put about the same amount of water into this container, And what I ended up with here was my dry leaves are now damp. So they are no longer as dry and crunchy as they were when we first started. And I did end up with a little bit of sediment in my container, but I have mostly clear water. So if I put my hand behind this container, you can actually see my hand through the container. And you'll also notice that there is significantly more water in my container that was just dirt versus my container that was dirt and some dried leaves. Now in my third experiment, this is the one where I had the vegetation. And with my vegetation, what I see is that there is a little bit of dirt, and that's partially because in order to plant those plants, I did have to put more dirt into this container than I did into my other two containers. Okay, so there is a little bit more dirt, so that might explain part of the reason why I had some dirt, but there's hardly any water at all in the bottom of this container. And the water that is there is clear. And so what we were talking about with this one is that it is unique because it has those roots that are part of the plant's vascular system that are absorbing the water that goes into the soil and pulling that water through the vascular tissue and moving that water around the plant using that xylem. And so that becomes a very, very important piece of how vegetation is such a critical piece to protecting our ecosystems and stopping erosion from happening. Okay, so now that you have your foldable all completed and filled out, we're going to start at the very top with erosion by water. So if you want to draw a line, I usually draw lines on mine just to make it easier so I can tell where I need to stop writing because I'm going into the next section. You can also write on the back side of yours too if you need more room, and that is no problem at all. But we're going to start off by saying that erosion by water is going to be the movement of sediment by water. And that is exactly what we saw during our activity today. Today, as we were watching the activity and we were working on seeing what happens when we pour water into different types of materials, we saw that dirt was moving from the container, the 2-liter container with the dirt and the rocks and the sand, and that was moving into that little cup we had at the bottom. So we were actually watching erosion by water. Another term that we talked about was infiltration. And infiltration is going to be the process of water moving through soil and rock. So as the water rains down on our planet, it is going to hit the surface of the soil, and some of it is going to do, it's called runoff, which means it's going to run toward a stream or toward a puddle or toward something. It's going to run off into some kind of body of water. You're also going to have some of that water, though, that is going to absorb into the surface of the planet. And that water that absorbs into the surface of the planet is going to soak down into the soil, then down into the rock layers, and eventually, many times, they'll get stored in an underground layer that we call an aquifer, which is a saturated zone of rock where water is stored underwater. And as it moves down through that rock and through that soil, that is what we call permeable rock, which means it has tiny, tiny holes in it, almost kind of like a sponge. And so it actually filters the water and cleans the water as it moves down through that process, and that's why it's referred to as infiltration. The next definition that we're going to look at is deposition. So deposition is the process of adding sediment to a landform. So if you think about that, all that sediment that washed out in our activity today, if we were to continue pouring that water out, then we would end up with this clump of dirt that would eventually form into something, right? So like we can think about it being like a little hill of dirt, and then eventually as more and more rain came into those containers, you would have even more dirt that was flowing out of the 2-liter bottles, and eventually you would have a pretty large hill made of the dirt. And so that is the deposition. So whenever we have the process of adding sediment to a landform, a lot of times when we're talking about this with water, what you'll see is deltas that are at the end, like where the river will go into the ocean. There'll be like this kind of triangle shape, which is referred to as a delta. And that's because there is a lot of buildup of sediment at that location. Next, we have erosion. Erosion is the movement of sediment from one location to another. Now, a lot of times the word erosion will get confused with the word weathering. So it's very important that you know the difference between these two terms. Weathering is the actual breaking up of a larger piece of material. So for instance, like a big rock. that gets broken into smaller pieces. That is weathering. Moving those smaller pieces, which are now the sediment, to another location is erosion. So erosion is the actual process of moving that material from one location to another. Our next term is sediment. Sediment is going to be the material that is broken down by weathering and is then transported by erosion. So this is going to be the bits of dirt or the little bits of rock or sand or anything that is a particle that is being broken down and then moved around is going to be referred to as sediment. Sediment is sometimes also defined as the material that will sink to the bottom of a container. So like if you think about if you have a container with water and sand in it and you shake it up, the sand is initially going to be suspended in the water, so the water is going to look cloudy, but eventually we would say that sand settles to the bottom, and that would also be another definition that is sometimes used for sediment. Next, we're going to look at wetlands. Wetlands are areas that consist of marshes and swamps. Now, wetlands are very, very important to the ecosystem in the United States, and specifically our ecosystem in North Carolina. So it is something that we definitely want to consider whenever we're talking about water and we're talking about erosion by water and we're talking about the removal of vegetation. We do really need to consider what the effect of that is on the wetlands in North Carolina. And so I did want to definitely bring up this definition of wetlands because as we talk about human impacts on our ecosystems, considering how our activities are affecting the wetlands is a very important piece of understanding North Carolina's ecological systems. Next, we have river basin. So as we were looking at the creek, I talked to you about the river basins and the watersheds. And the river basin is going to be the portion of land that's drained by a river and its tributaries. And I told you that the Rockfish Creek is actually a tributary to the Cape Fear River. And so it is part of the Cape Fear River Basin because it does eventually drain into the Cape Fear River. Now, in addition to that, it is also a watershed area. And a watershed is going to be an area of land that catches rains and drains into a marsh, stream, or river. So the Rockfish River in the area that we were looking at today is also a watershed because it does send the water, it catches the water from rain and it puts it into the Rockfish Creek, and eventually that goes out to the Cape Fear River and then to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so after you finish that up, the last thing that I would really like for you to do today is just reflect on what we talked about by going back to those I can statements. So if you'll remember, we first said, I can explain how erosion changes the earth by transporting sediment from one area to another. So now, based on what you learned in that activity, can you explain that? The second thing I would like you to look at is, can you analyze the rate of erosion and how it's affected by vegetation? Okay, so that would be a summary piece that you could do. And you could just write a quick paragraph that just describes those two things. So you're going to do your summary. And in your summary, you want to answer 1, can you explain how the earth is changed by erosion? So changes to earth by erosion. And 2, can you explain or analyze how vegetation affects erosion? All right, so I truly hope that you enjoyed the lesson today. I really enjoyed having a chance to get to talk to all of the kids in North Carolina. I had a lot of fun preparing this lesson for you, and I hope that you are really all enjoying and embracing the opportunity to get some lessons from different teachers and to be able to do some of your lessons from home. So if you ever have any questions about anything with science or anything with Avid, I would love to answer your questions. So you can always find me by looking me up on the directory for Cumberland International Early College High School. And I really hope that at some point in the future, I get to meet each and every one of you. I feel like we have the most amazing kids in the state of North Carolina, and I am thrilled to have the opportunity to be a teacher in this amazing state. So I hope everyone has a great few weeks. Stay healthy and make sure you wash your hands.